In Chapter 9 of Lyme, the first epidemic of climate change, what did you mean by childhood lost?
CDC statistics show that children from 5 to 14 years old are the most frequently bit population out there among age groups, especially boys 5 to 9 years old. I have interviewed many parents whose children have lost months and years to Lyme disease. Guidance counselors tell me this. School nurses tell me this. Everybody but mainstream medicine seems to know that Lyme disease can cause lasting, severe effects that aren't something else, but they are Lyme disease, or they began with the bite of a tick. And in that chapter, I tell stories of children who have experienced this sort of thing. A young girl who was 6 years old in Fossil, Oregon, where Lyme disease wasn't well known when she was bitten in the 1980s, although there was, I found, a scientific study that found the ticks, that found the organism right there in the area of Oregon where she lived. And she had trouble getting diagnosed. She had trouble getting treated. Her parents, at one point, had to flee their home with her because her doctors wanted to treat her for leukemia. And at that stage in the evolution of medicine, being treated for leukemia was pretty much a death sentence for a child. So they fled. With the Child Protective Services on their heels. They eventually were able to come back. But they they tried many different things to deal with what was ultimately deemed to be a case of Lyme disease. And they ended up at the University of Texas, where a researcher was studying hyperbaric oxygen therapy for Lyme disease patients. This is something that is still used today. Particularly and most recently in combination with antibiotics and with some success. And anyway, she had a 90-day course of intense treatment a couple of times a day with hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and she recovered. She didn't recover to the point where she got all of her functioning back. Today she is still in a wheelchair, but she got her life back. The damage had been done to her body by virtue of Lyme disease. She's still in a wheelchair, but she rides a horse. She lives on a ranch. She hosts a bed and breakfast on her family ranch, where she's told about 30,000 people her story of Lyme disease. I also tell of other children who have had serious cases of Lyme disease. There was a young boy by the name of Troy, who at 10 years old was diagnosed with Lyme disease, briefly treated, relapsed about 6 weeks later. He got to the point where he couldn't get out of bed. He was hospitalized a couple of times, sent home with psychiatric medications, not treated for Lyme disease. Eventually, he was treated by one of these terrific Lyme literate doctors by the name of Dr. Jones. And after spending about 2 years in bed, Troy is upright again. He is back in school. He is functioning. He is more or less healthy. He has some residual impacts from Lyme disease. It can be a terribly disabling disease for children, and it can be an interruption of major consequence to childhood.
What are the best ways, or how do we avoid getting Lyme disease?
Well, Lyme disease has changed our relationship with nature. I live on a field in New York State, right on the edge of a field. And it's an old cornfield, and we bought 2 acres of it, and we put a little house up. And our neighbor bought the other 7 acres. And we actually mow a path around that field so that people can enjoy the field without getting bitten by ticks. Because if you venture into that tall grass, you're going to pick up ticks in certain seasons of the year, seasons which, by the way, are growing longer and longer. And when I moved to the Hudson Valley of New York 35 years ago, I looked at that field with a different eye. It was a beautiful place. It grew corn in the winter, in the summertime, and in the spring. And we would, go through the rows of corn and sometimes pick them. That was cow corn, didn't taste very good. But it was a beautiful place to see those transitions year after year. In the winter, we did, and I still do, cross-country ski there. In the fall, I would watch the tree line turn colors. Now I look at that field and I see danger. I see something I have to warn my grandchildren about. I see a place that can impart diseases that we never had 3 decades ago. So how do we protect ourselves against that very thing? And we need to do that, whether we're walking through a field or gardening in our backyard, or walking our dog, by the way, because dogs will pick them up, the edges of a roadside where you bring your dog to do his business. Be vigilant. Wear clothing that is impregnated with permethrin. You can buy permethrin on Amazon or in a hardware store. And you basically spray it on soak your socks and your trousers and maybe a hat even, or your shirt. And it will last through several washings, 6 to 12 if you do it yourself. If you buy the clothing that is impregnated with permethrin, as, by the way, military fatigues are and have been for a couple of decades, it costs a lot more, but it lasts a lot longer. Something like 70 washings it will last for. And this stuff kills ticks on contact. It doesn't just repel them. There was one study, and you don't have to do your entire wardrobe, that showed that people who had sprayed their sneakers, their boots, and their socks alone and tucked their pants into their socks were something like 75 times less likely to be bitten by a tick. So that's a good thing to do. I also treat the periphery of my property with an all-natural kind of compound. I think the main thing that's in it is rosemary oil, but there are a number of different natural compounds that you can ask a pesticide applicator to put on your property, or you can buy yourself. You have to check yourself after you come in from being outside. Check your clothing, wear light-colored clothing so it's easier to see. Throw your clothing into the dryer for 15 minutes. That will kill ticks. Take a shower. Just be careful. Stay in the center of trails. Don't brush up against grass. We have to be really careful and vigilant against ticks if we are to remain healthy in the world in which we live today. I would also say that if you are bitten by a tick, you should be aggressive. If you think you have Lyme disease, go to your doctor. If your doctor says, I want to wait for the test, but you have symptoms, you have fever, you have chills, you have flu-like symptoms in the summertime when the flu is not prevalent, say to your doctor, what's the harm of giving me a course of antibiotics? I want treatment. I want treatment for my child, because it's much riskier to withhold treatment than to take a short course of antibiotics. You have to be your own advocate these days. So I would say if you're bitten by a tick, make that effort. Go to the doctor. Now, there's one thing, though, that I have to caution against. And doctors will often give a single dose of doxycycline as a prophylactic against Lyme disease if you're bitten by a tick. And that's based on one study and one study alone. There are other studies that were done on animals that show it has very little effect. And in fact, it can have a harmful effect because early on in the disease, you're given 2 pills, in a single dose of doxycycline. And as a result, your immune system is suppressed from building those antibodies. You don't develop those antibodies to Lyme disease as you might otherwise. So there's a downside. We don't know how well this works as a prophylactic, and there's great reason to suggest that it's not very effective. And secondly, it may suppress your ultimate ability to test positive for Lyme disease, should you get it.